Hello, I'm Hsing-ay and welcome to the Pathway Forward series at the NUMEG studio in New York. I am so thrilled to be interviewing pianist superstar Ursula Oppens here in New York, just across the park from me, actually. Good morning, Ursula.
Good morning, Hsing-ay. I'm so happy to be here, and it's a wonderful morning.
It is. It's amazing that life can go on despite all the obstacles in the path of our way in 2020. It's new ways of doing things and new discoveries. So I just want to say that I've known you by reputation so long as a superstar, long before I had the opportunity to audition for you and then to study with you at Tanglewood years ago. And you've just worked with, every big name composer I can think of. Distinguished professor of music at Brooklyn College and CUNY, and faculty at Manus, and so many things to so many generations of people, of students, and of colleagues. And so you're such a unique artist.
You're so kind, but I have, in fact, had an absolutely wonderful and exciting life. And yes, a lot of the center of it has been the ability to work with other musicians of my time, composers and performers, and that has been so thrilling and so life-giving. And I'm happy that it has meant something to people a little bit younger than me too. Um, and it has been an example of the fact that, especially classical musicians, we think about Beethoven, we think about Bach, and they were in the past and they wrote great music that means so much to us right now. But there are also people writing great music right now.
Yeah.
And you don't have to only think, oh, well, that was the great past. It's not with us anymore. It is, the great past has become the great present.
Right. I think Charles Warren said one time that you were devoted to the cause of living music. And I thought, what a great phrase, because you're co-creating it, you're bringing it to life.
Well, yes. And of course, as a performer, there are two aspects to it. We have a score that can mean slightly different things, like how loud is forte? Well, no one really knows how loud forte is. So that's the fun of it. And this is actually something Charles Warren mentioned, that why he prefers writing scores to doing electronic music is that he likes the fact that there's still some indeterminacy, even if you're trying to do it as accurately as possible.
Hmm.
Then again, there's been the opportunity to play for the composer and find out what he or she had in mind. And that's something one can only do when the composer is alive.
Yes, yes. And so there were so many pieces that were written specifically for you. What are some of the, I don't know, the changes in the process as you're working through pieces with composers?
Well, I think the most important thing for me is to make no assumptions when I start a piece, because I'm not a composer. So I always think of the last piece I played, but a composer can think of the next piece. And so I find that if I want that the I should not try to make a new piece fall into the assumptions that I used for another piece, even if it's another piece by the same composer. Um, and so I kind of try to a little bit empty my mind, and I usually start on the upper left corner, which is where it starts, and um, try to pay attention all the time to all the markings there are. And this actually applies to older music as well. I mean, if you see something that's pianissimo, it is really different from something that's forte. And it's part of the character from the first moment. And things like that. If you see that there's a slur, a phrase mark, it means that the composer wants this music to belong together. What's the relationship of the previous music to it? So you kind of try to take in all these things a little bit from the very beginning, you know. I mean, you also, of course, the pitches are the most important thing, but you try not to look at them in a vacuum. And it's sort of fun, though, to suspend one's previous ideas about what a piece should sound like, because I mean that's the real fun. You can't go onto YouTube and listen to the piece. You,
Right.
you know, so you have to create it just from this abstract notation, and that one has to think of. I mean, it's hard, but it is truly fun.
And that's such a great analogy for what life has been like during this pandemic. I certainly came in with some assumptions of what my life should have looked like. And then we have to give that up because we have to start from scratch and look at the context of what's actually happening, and create something without assumptions of what life should be.
Right. And for instance, as we mentioned at the very beginning, we are so fortunate to have other ways of being together right now. And this is one of them, of course.
Right.
And it's very exciting because you and I, when you lived in Colorado, we saw each other a couple of times. But in fact, now that you're in New York, we've seen each other more.
Yeah. Yeah, it's been really amazing to be in New York, and while I only moved here a few months ago, and you've been here all your life. I
Right.
mean, so you started out in New York and went to Bruley and came back after Radcliffe, which was part of Harvard. And so New York, how has it changed for you as a place? I mean, this year, but also in terms of how New York has grown.
Well, okay, New York has always been a walking city. And when I was young, it wasn't very safe. And I remember living with my parents on 85th Street. For about 5 or 6 years, there was a murder every year on the block. Once in a while, it was just someone seeing, does his gun work? You know, not really wanting to kill anyone, but just checking out the gun.
Oh my goodness.
Now it is a much, much, much safer city, though a little bit with the pandemic, people have gone a little bit stir crazy, so it's not quite as safe as it was last year, but I think it will be again. But the main thing is that it's a city where you walk on the street, and it always has been, and you run into people you know, and you're not anonymous. And um, I, an analogy that I've thought of for many, many, many years is, or an example is, let's say you say, well, I'm too busy to rehearse this week. I'm out of town. And then you go to buy a quart of milk. And at the grocery store, you see the person you told you were out of town. Now it's a little harder because I don't recognize everyone when they're wearing a mask.
Yes.
And but still we wave at each other and enjoy it. Yeah.
It's been interesting to me how much I pay attention to people's eyes and try to infer like what their expression is. But even in chamber music, like so at YCA when my husband Dan Kellogg was producing the concert with chamber music, and I was watching their eyes do all the cueing
Yeah.
in what we used to always do with breath, and you can't see the breath anymore. So I guess there's always ways to adapt.
Well, it's interesting because I've been, coaching some chamber music in
Yeah.
this, and I realized that I should people who are playing on Zoom actually don't have to wear masks because they're each in their own separate place, but they don't look at each other. I think I just realized, well, one thing to encourage is that on Zoom you can see people breathe, you can see people cue, and this should become part of the new. I mean, not, the new chamber music will be over in a while. We do have vaccines. There will be an end to this, but in the meantime, it's fabulous to learn how to adapt to new situations, and um, I think learning to look at someone on Zoom and play with them is very good and something I want to work on next semester.
Yeah, this adaptability, you're right that these situations is forced growth. We are forced to be more flexible than we were. I'd love to circle back to how you discovered your unique ability to collaborate closely with composers. Um, I know that in your school days you were talking about John Harbison as an early collaborator.
Yes, well, okay, I should start with the fact that my parents were refugees from Europe and they felt they had left great culture behind, even though most of the great European composers had come to America by then, actually. But they were very sad about it in a way. And I learned actually later in life, I mean, well after college, that my mother had actually taken a course with Anton Webern,
Wow.
and, and that my father had been a member of the Society for, I think, the ISCM. He joined when he came to this country, basically. So they had an interest in new music, but they didn't really tell me about it, but I must have felt it. And, and both my parents were musicians. And I went to college at Radcliffe, Harvard, which did not have a performance department. So it had a number of wonderful performers, but also it did have a lot of composition. And actually, I met both Rosemary Harbison and John Harbison at more or less the same time. Rosemary is a fabulous violinist, and we played a lot together. And John is, a great composer. I didn't even know what the future would bring, but, and they were a few years older than me. And so at my YCA debut, which was in 1969, I played John's Parody Fantasy, which is a wonderful piece. What can I say? What interests me about sometimes atonal music is when the pitch relationships aren't so obvious as 5/1 in tonal music, and yet they have just as much tension, and it comes to you a little bit more slowly, but then there is this tension between this pitch and that, and they want to be together or they want to be apart, and that becomes some of what is so exciting about the music, and especially John's music has a lot of that. And I've played his music basically all my life. A few years ago, I played some new songs of his at Tanglewood, and been it's been very exciting. As I said, that thing about the pitch relationships, you only find that out, and it's emotional. I'm not a theorist or good at analyzing. It takes a while, you work on a piece and then you realize, oh, I love how this goes from this to that. And, it becomes very exciting, and it becomes internal. And I also like the fact that I didn't know it to start with, whereas with a Beethoven sonata that you've heard since you were, 4 years old, it actually takes longer to discover those relationships because you take them for granted when you're 4, you take them for granted when you're 8, and you're taking them, and then you're working on it and you're in your 40s, and finally you feel it in a different way.
Yeah. Yeah, it's amazing. So I think we both share this idea of how being involved in new music helps us to be more aware and more heightened to the emotional content of older music like Beethoven and Mozart. I mean, like they actually make us more aware because
Absolutely, yes.
those are actually the same kinds of tension release, the kind of content that now is just written into a new language. I remember when I was at Juilliard, I got to take one class at Columbia University as part of their exchange program, and it was comparative literature. And this one thought that really stuck with me throughout the years is the teacher was talking about how we study the old canon of literature, but even as we're speaking, it's being replaced by a new canon. And like I never thought of it. I never thought of the reality as a changing body all the time. And new music is coming into it, is becoming our canon, even as we're talking right now. And I thought that was really fascinating and really not static. It's really a dynamic world that we're in.
Well, it's not that long ago that Pierrot Lunaire and the Rite of Spring became over 100 years old. That's
Wow.
as we grew up. I mean, even you grew up with those as sort of the archway gates to new,
Yes.
you know,
Yeah.
you're over 100 years old.
Wow. Yeah, that's interesting. And now you've created so many new works, co-created so many new works that is the classics of contemporary music for my generation. I remember when I was at Juilliard, it was still really hard to talk about new music with people because everyone was thinking about playing Tchaikovsky concertos and things like that. And we've made progress in terms of new music being part of the standard literature.
Absolutely. I mean, it's changed, and I think, I mean, I think it was the same thought that it was so depressing to think that music is dead and in the past. And then we realized, oh, it's right here, it's right everywhere, and it isn't dead. And, it doesn't even have to wait for spring and the new flowers. You know?
Yeah, sometimes it's hard to see what's right in plain sight.
Yeah. And of course, well, I mean, especially I have to say that your husband, Dan, is a composer, and he is now head of Young Concert Artists, which I I think is one of the most wonderful organizations there ever was, which helped me. I mean, it helped me get started, but it did so much more than that. I mean, it helped me get started, it helped me get going, it helped me continue. And that it's a composer who heads it also tells us a little bit about the importance of there being new music as part of all music, that yes, that it's alive.
Yeah, Dan is the reason that I became aware of new music at all. Because we met in Aspen, and we should talk about Aspen next. But when I was 17, I was still in high school. Dan and I had been taking private conducting lessons with someone just to study, and so this teacher told us to look out for each other. We were both going to end up in Aspen that summer, and we met, we went on a date the next morning, and then that was history.
17. Oh, that's really fantastic. I didn't know that.
It was all because of Aspen bringing us together, bringing so many people together. But before then, and he challenged me. I was completely focused on classical music. You know, all the great masterpieces.
Yeah.
And he really challenged me to look at music in a fresh way, that it's something that is created right now. And when I won the Gilmore, he was the first composer I ever commissioned, ever worked with as a
Mhm.
person, as a live living person. But Aspen, the magic of Aspen. I have your dad's book, Kurt Oppens on music.
Wow.
Great book. I knew him through his writings first, and then Bruce Berger, a friend, a local author in Aspen, knew him much better than I did, and I got to learn a little bit more about his history. But your father is so multi-dimensional and is so many disciplines in his background. It's so interesting how he makes all these connections when he thinks and talks. Um, what was that like?
Well, I mean, he was my beloved father. That was the main thing. He was trained as a lawyer in Germany. And then he took a leave, and he was appointed to judge because it was a different system. You don't run for election. And then he took a 1 year leave of absence to study musicology, during which Germany passed a law that people of Jewish descent couldn't be judges. And so then he changed his field to musicology.
Mhm.
Um, but he supported the family tuning pianos, which is what he did in Aspen too. And I think a lot of his creativity came from the fact that he wasn't obliged to meet a deadline. Like tuning pianos is a little bit like for us practicing scales. You know,
Yes.
you know what you're doing, but it doesn't take 100% of your concentration all the time, you know? And so, or taking walk. So he was, I think, free in a way. He wasn't constrained, let's say, by certain schools of thought that would be apparent in one branch of academia or other. And once in a blue moon, he entirely invented something. Like there might be a letter that is referenced that never existed. And I had a friend who was writing the gossip column for the Aspen Times, and she did the same thing once in a while.
Yeah, but I love this the freedom and the broadness of his viewpoints and also of your viewpoints, you know, and embracing the new and this kind of I mean, I see it as kind of an optimism, you know, like to
Sure, sure. I mean, because it's a real sadness to think that there is no new. I mean, if there is no new, then you're in a field. I mean, no, of course it's optimism. I mean, it's and it's wanting to be part of the world. It's wanting to see what will happen too.
yes.
Yeah.
Right, right. That's great. And so juxtapose that with more traditional teachers in your life. How can you give us an idea of how the spectrum of teachers affected your viewpoints?
Well, um, you had mentioned, of course, my teacher at Juilliard, who was Rosina Lhévinne, whom I loved very, very much. And of course, she had gone to school with Rachmaninoff and Prokofiev. Those were her contemporaries. We think of that as old music, but for her, it was new music.
Right.
But I remember also once, for some reason, I was listening to a lesson she was giving to Edward Auer, and he was playing the Carter Sonata for her. And so she called up Elliot Carter and said, I have a wonderful student. Could he come and play for you? So she was completely up to the times. She was also very much part of the times. I was studying with her in the late 60s. And when Martin Luther King was shot, she couldn't teach for a month, really, because she was so upset. But we took some walks together, and she just wanted to talk about his importance, and what he meant to her, what he meant to the world. And she was also, I remember she at one point said she couldn't understand why her children were so conservative, because some of her favorite students were homosexual, and she thought that was fine. They were wonderful people and wonderful pianists, and she didn't see anything wrong with that. And this was 1968, 69. And the walks we took and the conversations we had were just as important to me as playing the piano for her. She was really looking also for the meaning in music. The other thing I loved about Juilliard was that at Radcliffe and Harvard, it was considered not very cool to have to work very hard to do something. You were just supposed to write a paper. And at Juilliard, it was okay. Yes, I did practice 7 hours yesterday. And it was all right to work as hard as you could. And that also felt very freeing, because you didn't have to you could admit that you had to try to be able to accomplish something.
Yeah, we were on the other end of the problems of practicing too much and like when do we stop? But going back to Radcliffe, how did you make the choice as such a serious performer as you were to go to a place where there really wasn't a performance focus?
Well, I'll give two answers to it. The first answer is that when I was 17, I was asked, what do I want to do when I grow up? And I said, I haven't the slightest idea, but I'm sure I don't want to be a musician. Now that's answer number one. Answer number two is that in a way I had more performance opportunities there than one has at a conservatory. I mean, I won the concerto contest in my freshman year, and then but there were other orchestras. So I played a concerto almost every year. I was allowed to play a chamber music concert, several in my first year, which sometimes at conservatories they say, oh, no, 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 you're not supposed to do that. So I was really allowed to play as much as I wanted. And I still feel a certain ambiguity about the rules at conservatories that keep young people, keep freshmen and sophomores sometimes from performing as much as they could. And well, I still have mixed feelings about that, because I played all the time. I mean, one of the reasons I played concerts is that's how I got to practice on a good piano. Because I said, oh, can I play a concert in your dorm, in your common room, and then practice on it. So.
Well, in my Yale days, I was at Yale as a grad, and I remember going to all these undergrad events because they had such a great musical life in the undergrad colleges.
I mean, I feel disloyal to wherever I've been teaching by saying this, but there's a lot to be said for schools where just the performers are left on their own.
Yeah, that's so interesting. But I mean, you were taking lessons throughout?
No.
No. So you just had a time to kind of reflect on what you wanted to do musically.
I was, actually, when I finished college, I was really behind, and not having had lessons for most of the 4 years was not a great thing. But it didn't kill me. And, there were incredible things. Like in my freshman year, Leon Kirshner was there for his first year, and he put together a performance of Les Noces, and I got to be one of the pianists.
Oh,
and
fun
one of
piece.
the singers was Beverly Sills. And, I mean, this is 1960, February of 1962.
Oh, oh, that's so fun. I
Yes.
also got to play Les Noces, and the reason I was ecstatic was that I didn't have to learn the Russian. That Russian diction was so scary. I mean, I gave it a try, but
Yeah, but so, random experiences are really fantastic, and basically, if I were to give advice to a young person, it's say yes. If you're whatever you're asked to do. I mean, in music and not in other things.
uh-huh.
Just try it out, you
Yes.
know.
Well, and also in life, I guess sometimes we pigeonhole ourselves into only applying for conservatories, right? And when you have so much richness and you create your own, like you produced the concerts that you were doing, then it gives you a kind of ownership
Yeah.
in different places.
And the other thing, speaking of producing concerts, the other really, really important part of my life was forming the group Speculum Musicae. And it was, there had been, there still is a group at Juilliard, the Juilliard Ensemble. And a number of my friends were in it. But I wasn't in it. They had other pianists. And my friends said, well, wouldn't it be nice to have our own group where we could choose our own repertoire? And with the great support of Charles Warren, who said, you can do it. And in that sense, I will be forever grateful to him, because for an adult, an established adult, to say to younger people, yes, go out on your own, you can do it, don't be afraid, is the most important advice anyone can get. And we formed a group, and we got backing. Young concert artists, for instance, took us on, and which was really fantastic. But other people also supported us, and we learned how to fundraise. We learned how to keep a budget. We learned how to do all the things that we learned. We became a nonprofit. We learned how to do these, bit by bit. We didn't need an entrepreneurship course. We just sort of plowed ahead. And we also, I mean, I remember a friend once called us the 15 most neurotic musicians in New York. But we were able to choose programs. We were able to sometimes commission pieces. Um, it was a wonderful experience. And I know you had a group in Colorado. Full,
Pendulum New Music Program,
yeah.
which was a slightly different model because I was trying to help composers and performers learn how to work together.
Okay.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, but like what you were saying, yeah, you learn bit by bit and you grow on the job, wear
yeah.
many different hats.
Mhm. And it's really wonderful. And it's also, again, a sense of you don't have to stick with what is there in front of you. You could also try something to do something that's a little bit out of, there's no path that has been cleared yet. And you sort of clear your own path. And that's very exciting personally and musically. And because these paths, I mean, tell us, could you tell us a little bit more about Pendulum? I know you interview other people, but I'm going to interview you now.
Well, the idea of Pendulum, when I came in, it was a really great period for me because it had not really had a clear vision. So communications was such a huge, and continues to be such a huge interest for me. Like, how do you connect people who speak different languages and translate and help them understand each other and ask really important questions to get to the heart of the music. And I always started with what is the composer's intent? And I was really surprised at how
many people do not ever really ask that question, right? Because like you look at Mozart and you think, oh, okay, how did this recording play, or how did that artist interpret it? And you forget that the most important thing is that Mozart had a vision and he's communicating through all these musical elements, and that's what makes new music so exciting and kind of a refresher in our brain, like, oh, okay, every single composer had their own intention, and so that's what Pendulum was for me, is a way to teach students how to refocus when they're looking at music. And you were the very first artist I booked as our guest performer because you
Oh
embody
my
that.
goodness. Oh, that's amazing. But we've come back several times to the fact also that it's by looking at new music that we learn how to read and play the music of the past.
Mhm.
And it comes back over and over again. And it's kind of amazing that um, how much this helps us. And it's it always surprises me. I mean, it surprises. And it's as if by looking at something that's right in front of us, we learn how to look at something that used to be at a distance from us. And now we can pretend it's again right in front of us.
Right. Right, because despite all the innovations, it's the core ideas and the core humanity are still the same. We're still all humans trying to figure out life and express it through a different language.
Yes. And we have to learn. I mean, as you were talking about learning Russian, and each language might be different, but the stresses and relaxations within it, there are many that are the same from one, that the idea of danger in many different languages, diminished chords. We want to feel that even though it's a different language. And I think by learning languages we didn't take for granted, we understand a little bit more about the specificity of the languages that we think we've known all along.
Right.